Okay, welcome everyone to today's New Jersey Community Colleges Practitioners Scholars webinar. I'm Jake Fargnoli with the New Jersey Council of County Colleges. We're delighted you all could join us this afternoon. We are featuring today adapting to new ways of meeting the community college mission with Dr. Jessica Fargnoli, Assistant Director of Public Relations from Bergen Community College, and Dr. Ian Wolf, Assistant Dean for Student Engagement at Passaic County Community College. We'll have time for some brief Q&A after each of our presenters have had a chance to share their dissertation findings and learnings with us. If you have questions, please hold them till then, or if you'd like to post them into the chat, we'll review the chat at the end of each of our presenters' presentation and have Q&A then. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Fargnoli of Bergen Community College. Jessica, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jake. I want to take the time to thank those colleagues, coworkers, friends, and family who took the time to join today's webinar. I'm very pleased to be able to present my research on exploring digital spaces in the virtual environment, analyzing higher education professionals' experiences with modern video conferencing at a community college. I also like to be able to thank and mention Dr. Cicerelli, who's the Dean of School of Education at St. Peter's University, Dr. Martin Legros, my dissertation chair, and Dr. Chris Rasmussen, my dissertation committee second reader, who have been able to join today's call. We have several different people from New Jersey, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Mexico who are joining today's call, so I really want to thank them for joining. My interest in video sparked while I was serving as a full-time lecturer and adjunct in communication, where I was able to incorporate video into the instructional methods that I utilized in the communication and public speaking courses that I taught over 10 years. It helped to instruct and develop communication skills and student reflection and help students become more effective communicators. Video is a powerful digital media tool that allows one to communicate oneself through the visual and oral image of the individual. Keeping in mind these different points about video, it brings me to the statement of the problem that I investigated in my dissertation. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, most higher education institutions were not on the digital transformation bandwagon. During the COVID-19 pandemic, higher education moved almost exclusively to online operations, causing an unprecedented upset and technological shift. This altered how institutions were able to conduct practical operations, including strategic, financial, and functional operations at institutions, and it also influenced how we constructed students. Administrators, faculty, and professional staff were not prepared for emergency remote instruction and operations. Learning experiences were hindered because of a lack of social connection. A third of faculty echoed this sentiment, reporting minimal social interaction and community building opportunities as a key obstacle. Video conferencing became a large part of the remote work environment for teaching and learning, as well as running an institution. Many faculty felt like they were instructional MacGyvers in emergency room remote instruction, while administrators and staff tried to bring the institution up to speed digitally. Primary data from 92 community colleges in the United States found that the majority of community college entrepreneurship educators were not familiar with exemplary education tools and applications, even though they had taught online previously. There was a seismic shift that happened where administrators and professional staff in various institutional departments had to learn how to shift to using video conferencing as a primary means and a way to conduct virtual meetings to facilitate internal communications, planning, and processes for teams. There were challenges and steps to create virtual meetings that encourage sharing ideas, listening, and collaboration for virtual teams within the video conferencing virtual environment. So to kind of just give a little bit more of a reference, when we are talking about digital spaces, virtual environment, and modern video conferencing, we have to keep in mind that space can develop a university community, and it's not just the physical space, it is also the digital space. That can have an impact on the emotional and motivational experiences of students. Keeping this in mind, since we are within this digital space itself, using the medium of video conferencing, that becomes the message in itself, and referencing McLuhan. Many of the audiences function in a visual screen-based world. Users must learn the language of the screen, per se. Video transcends a physical and temporal space. Michael Wesch also mentioned how video is almost language in itself, and he referred to it as speaking video. Video conferencing is a medium that's going to allow users to transcend physical and temporal space. McLuhan had argued that technology is an extension of oneself, and the technology, video conferencing, allows us to extend beyond the limits of what we can do as human beings. But at the same time, we have to face the demands of communicating social presence in technology. So with this backdrop in mind, when I was thinking about my research based on the statement of the problem, the theories behind it, I relied on Mark Prensky's theory of digital natives and digital immigrants. Digital natives are ones that are more accustomed to multitasking, visual literacy. They grew up around technology. They are native speakers of digital language of technology. Digital immigrants, on the other hand, may be less likely to pick up new technologies quickly. They may retain a digital immigrant accent. The challenge here is to provide a learning space that is relevant to digital natives and those who exhibit the characteristics of digital immigrants, both of whom work in virtual and real spaces. One of the quotes that I really rely on heavily here is the idea of the ability to succeed is the ability to adapt. It's about embracing and leading change, drawing on support from those around you. So keeping in mind Prensky's theory, it brought me to the idea of what are my research questions? What would I be studying with my dissertation? So I came up with 5 different research questions. What are the experiences of administrators, faculty, staff, and higher education professionals when using video conferencing? How do administrators, faculty, staff, and higher education professionals use video conferencing in their said role? What types or levels of social presence do administrators, faculty, staff, and higher education professionals demonstrate when using video conferencing? What are the ways in which administrators, faculty, staff, and higher education professionals engage digital native students via video conferencing? What additional challenges do digital immigrants face in developing social presence to connect and engage with digital natives? Which led me to my methodology. I chose to do a qualitative research case study that focused in on interview approach. I drew upon ethnographic approach. I conducted one-on-one interviews with 15 participants, 15 interviews. I selected a community college research site, which was a 2-year co-educational college in northern New Jersey with a diverse environment. 15 questions that I had focused in on was allowing participants to be able to share their strengths, weaknesses, frustrations, and challenges with video conferencing. I focused in on how they maintain presence and social interaction in video, what tools and techniques they use to engage participants on video conferencing calls, thoughts and feelings interacting in the digital space of video conferencing, perception of how others perceive them on video conference calls, and what they would have done differently to communicate and interact socially on video conference calls. In terms of my methodology, I had 15 participants. From there, after receiving IRB approval from the community college site, as well as through St. Peter's University, I had the signed informed consent forms. Interviews were conducted between September 2021 and November 2021. There was a choice to conduct the interview through a modern video conferencing system or in person. All participants chose to conduct the interviews in modern video conferencing system. We agreed upon using Zoom as that virtual interview means. Each of the participants were given a pseudonym, and from those 15 participants, I had 12 digital immigrants, 3 digital natives, 5 females, 10 males. 6 of the participants reported holding an administrative role or function at the community college. Only 2 participants actually held executive administrative roles based on title and rank at the community college. 6 participants reported holding a professional staff or staff role at the community college. 8 of the participants reported holding a faculty role at the community college. 3 participants reported holding both a professional staff and faculty role. 2 participants reported holding both a faculty and administrative role, and 1 participant reported a professional staff and administrative role. In my findings, I focused more on the factors that influenced their experience with video conferencing. There were certain contentions that emerged with the terminologies of digital native and digital immigrant that came through in the interviews. I found that an individual's personality and propensity towards technology influenced how they perceived video conferencing, how they interacted in it. An individual's willingness to learn the video conferencing was a big part of that as well, in terms of the analysis. One of the ones I want to point out was Charlie. He was a digital immigrant. He actually took issue with Princeton's terminology because he felt it was ageist, and he was adamant to engage in discussion about it. Although Charlie was born before 1980, he technically classified as a digital immigrant according to Prensky. He considered himself actually a digital native. And I quote, he said, "I consider myself a digital native because I'm using this technology since I was like, what do they call that? An initial user. I don't know what the word for it is, but the early adopter of all this technology, and I'm still using it." And he went on to further say, "I'm the techie guy in my department, and I'm the techie guy for this." So I did notice that some of those different contentions that emerged within the terminologies. Going on to the feelings about the digital space of video conferencing, I received 6 clear positive responses, 5 clear negative responses, and 3 conflicted positive and negative responses. Participant descriptors came from saying that they felt comfortable, that they felt pretty comfortable. Some said that they felt relaxed, relaxing atmosphere, positive experience. Some said that they enjoyed it. On the flip side, some of the negative responses were there was a disassociation, a discomfort, a self-consciousness. Some said they just got used to it. At points, some mentioned it was limiting, or then it became second nature to them. Some said there was not a lot of difference than a meeting in person. They felt it was productive. Some felt that they were a little nervous. Others felt there was a calmness to it. Some felt like a chore personally, another tool in the toolbox. And one of my favorite descriptors here was glad that we did it, even though it was difficult for everyone. So 3 emergent themes came through in my research. Presence, persona, social interaction, and conversation. So in the first one, presence addresses all 5 research questions, persona addresses all 5 research questions, and the social interaction conversation addresses all 5 as well. So looking at presence a little bit further, there were a couple different key elements that embody the idea of presence. All 15 participants described how it was important and essential in terms of video for having the camera on, to be seen as having presence in the video conference call. Both hosts and users in the video calls need to have their camera on or put their camera on when in a virtual meeting or conducting a class session. The second element that came through was the importance of audio. All 15 participants described the importance of audio so that individuals could hear one another clearly on video conference calls. All 15 also discussed about how the setting, where they discussed about lighting, background, and eliminating distractions, were part of creating and the importance of the right environment and eliminating distractions during video conferencing to create the best possible setting to communicate with others. 6 participants discussed the role of screen sharing and the chat box feature in video conferencing. And that was interesting as well, that participation in the chat box or screen sharing was seen as creating presence in a video conference, and it helped contribute towards the digital space overall. When we look at persona, there is almost like a digital persona that emerged here, and that refers to a user-centered design and representation of themselves to others in the virtual environment. And how do we get to that digital persona? Well, 2 major areas came through. This idea of presentation skills, where we're looking at somebody's appearance, their eye contact, their nonverbal cues, and how they're able to balance that based on their mental health of seeing themselves in a video conference, being able to communicate with others and have enough confidence during that. So all 15 participants had alluded to presentation skills and realized that the way that they handled themselves on video was essential. 4 participants described the importance of being able to present well on video conference calls. Presenters on video conference calls need to present information in an interesting way to be able to help contribute to their overall persona and how they were seen by others. 3 participants described how they realized the importance of dressing professionally or getting dressed in work clothes for video conferences. 5 participants described the importance of maintaining eye contact with others on the video conference calls. And 2 participants discussed how it was necessary to give people an opportunity to provide a physical response or physical reaction through nonverbal communication in video conferencing. In terms of the mental health part, this idea of being efficient, how it could also be draining at the same time, virtual work, managing self-speak and disassociation and check-ins. These were some parts of this idea of mental health that contribute to this persona of the individual on the call. About 15 participants felt that video conferencing was efficient and that they were able to get their work done. So they felt productive in the sense that that helped their overall mental well-being. Some participants described how working through video conferencing drained them. So that contributed to how they presented themselves in the persona, affected their mental health. One participant talked about this virtual work, and they described it as, I feel like every aspect of my job turned into some sort of video conference. So the lines seemed to become all video conferencing. It encompassed everything. That was the entire digital space. 2 participants described how they experienced difficulties in watching themselves have conversations through video conferencing. So the fact that they were seeing themselves while they were presenting, that was a difficulty. One digital immigrant who I assigned the name of pseudonym of Bob described how he struggled with disassociation in the video realm, and it was hard for him to stay present and focused because it was causing that mental health issue that was emerging. 2 digital immigrants, Bob and Sam, had mentioned about how it was like a mental thing, or the importance of mental health check-ins to help contribute to your overall persona and mental health. The next theme looked at social interaction and conversation. Social learning theorist Wegner wrote, "We are social beings," and this is a fact, a central aspect of learning. So it's important to be able to cultivate supportive online learning environments, and it's an art to be able to nurture connectedness and community through social presence. So what were some of the different ways in which that came through in the interviews? The hosts and users need to be in tune. To make video conferencing more meaningful, hosts and users need to be in tune with one another and develop skills in communicating online. 15 of the participants alluded to or referenced how it was important to start a video conference meeting with a greeting or asking how people were doing. Facilitation skills came through as well for that social interaction and conversation. Digital native Travis summarized it as the necessity of facilitating and being an engaged facilitator, meaning that he knew how to ask good questions, remain engaged, and remain present on the video conference call. There was also this idea of playfulness that emerged in that social interaction, and Soto supports that as well. There's a specific mode of playfulness in computerized mode of action, and that needed to come through in that social interaction of the digital space. Some engagement tools and techniques that came through were digital icebreakers, online discussions, breakout rooms, polls, virtual social hours, monthly themed department meetings. And this also came up in the interviews of how some use video escape rooms to help connect with other people, their teams on video conferencing, and to help with that digital space and the virtual environment, to feel connected as a team, to be able to function, to operate during this fully remote time period. So looking at the results a little bit further, digital natives saw video conferencing technology as simply another technology tool to use, not necessarily as something to conquer. Digital immigrants saw they had a learning curve to understand, utilize, and effectively implement the video conferencing technology. So what was interesting is the appropriate video conferencing technology, technical equipment, and technical setup played a role in how higher education professionals, most specifically digital immigrants, work toward presence and social presence. So meaning if they had certain technology and they felt more that technology setup was better for them, that helps contribute towards their presence on a video conference call. There was a requirement to create a confident and effective persona by overcoming mental health issues and developing their presentation skills at the same time. Another aspect was about considering engagement tools and techniques to engage digital native students through video conferencing. So those who were digital native students needed to be able to have certain engagement tools that were implemented. There was a proficiency in utilizing video conference tools helped create more presence and aided the development of social presence. So not only having some of these different technical equipment and everything helped created that presence, but you had to work to create that feeling that somebody was engaged on a video conference call and that they were engaging and interacting with the participants on the call. So let's look at some of the recommendations or implications for practice. Two major areas came through in the research. This idea of training and developing the digital space of video conferencing. So 12 participants came to the conclusion or outright reported that specific training should be provided to higher education professionals. So meaning they wanted training to help them to be able to operate and function in the digital space of video conferencing. And oftentimes in the interviews, they would just come out and outright state that. They also wanted to know how to communicate. The training would need to not only address how to use the various tools and functions within video conferencing, but it should focus on instructing individuals in how to communicate and present through video conferencing. When we look at developing the digital space of video conferencing, what came through was it needs to be more presentable and user-friendly. The community college site seemed to be aware that the actual digital space of video conferencing could be improved upon to come across as being more friendly or more presentable, and to make it more professional. One digital native, Travis, had mentioned how that he believes that there would be a way to make these more professional, more presentable, but it was like he was grasping for there's got to be something else here. I don't know specifically how to do it, but there's got to be a way. And so it came through in the research how it's important that we take the time as a community to be able to develop the digital space of video conferencing. Just as much as we think about the physical space of a campus, we also have to think about the digital space that we are operating in terms of video conferencing that we utilize for virtual meetings or for online instruction. So some different recommendations for interview topics or other areas to move forward. So any future researcher that would want to take on this topic of digital space of modern video conferencing, if they utilize my framework that I work through, future researchers may consider increasing the number of research sites. They may change what type of institution that they are looking at. Instead of maybe focusing in on looking at community college, they might look at maybe a four-year institution. We could also look at the higher education professional role and discipline. We could further drill down and look at somebody's technology experience and the digital native and digital immigrant classification. Future researchers may consider drilling down participant selection to actually unique gender, racial, ethnic, or cultural demographics to understand the specific experiences of these groups within the digital space of modern video conferencing, to examine possible qualitative themes that may be exclusive to those categories. In my interviews that I conducted, there were a couple different recommendations for future interview topics that seemed to emerge, and this idea of extensions and boundaries of technology. Let's look at the technological blur between work and personal life, where things kind of just seem like it was all together at once. Maybe this needed further examination. The perception of user self-concept versus how others perceive them. So how somebody might have felt may have been different than how you were perceived on a video conference call. Examining the virtual settings versus the face-to-face settings, an individual's experience versus the actual reality. So in conclusion, and these are some different references that I've included with my presentation, I think that the digital space of video conferencing is not going to go away anytime soon, and I think it's an area that needs to be explored further. I think my research is that starting point for future researchers. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you. We very much appreciate you sharing your dissertation learnings with us and your study and the framework of it and methodology. We have minimally one question in the chat, but we want to open it to all of you on the line. If you have any questions, let's go to the chat first. Catherine Edward asks, is the sample selected from a larger universe, the sample for your study, is the sample selected from a larger universe, or was this a small self-selected sample?
So in terms of, I went through a open call within faculty, staff, within that higher education professional experience. So it was an open call within the community college site. It wasn't, you know, a selection there. Anybody who wanted to who fit that category could be able to participate in my study.
So I believe the answer is A, from a larger universe, the universe of those folks at that community college. Any other questions across the board? Let's see, anyone have a hand up or coming off of mute? I can be the icebreaker. We have time for questions. So Jessica, I'll ask a question. I'll take the liberty to ask a question if no one else is going to ask a question. So we saw your conclusions and recommendations for further study and implications, but with your experience, I'd be interested with your experience, both as a faculty member, as you shared, faculty member, now administrator, and having conducted this survey and having spent much time, like most of us, probably all of us in COVID, adapting to using this technology. It's, as you said in your presentation at the conclusion, it's not going away. It's something that we're using going forward. I mean, we're on a webinar right now. What's maybe one or two things that you would draw upon, both your research study and your own experiences, that we may be able to use in our work that'll help us better utilize this technology going forward, recognizing we're still going to have in-person meetings, we're still going to have the traditional good old phone calls, we're still going to have face-to-face classroom instruction, but more and more we're going to be using this technology to help complement the work we do and the work we used to do pre-COVID and being forced to use it. So what are one or two things based on your experiences and the study that might be helpful for all of us to take away from?
I think the most important thing to consider is that we can't shy away from the digital space of video conferencing. I think it's important that oftentimes people might be scared or concerned about embracing a technology. I think that there is a way that we can still operate with it. We would still have in-person types of meetings, but there are a lot of different avenues that we can incorporate that, whether it's like hybrid or to be able to conduct meetings like we're doing right now, webinars. So I think it's important not to be afraid of it. The two key takeaways, if I was going to look at from my research here, it's really trying to establish a presence when you're on a video conference call. And I shared some of the different things that came through in my research, but making sure that you think about your presence. How am I interacting with others on the video conference call? How am I striving to make sure that I do have that level of presence? The other thing is, what's your digital persona? What's the persona that you're sharing with everybody else? So if anything from everything I talked about, if you focus more on the persona and the presence, I think that would help us tremendously when we think about the digital space of video conferencing.
That's terrific, Jessica. Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm going to take those away. I don't know about everybody else, but I'm going to take those away. So we have a couple other things in the chat, and then we will move on to Ian, who's with us from Susan Iverson. Thanks for sharing your work, Jessica. I have several doctoral students interested in studying virtual teaching, particularly through COVID, the COVID pivot. Your work is an important contribution for what that has meant for professionals versus just instructors. So a nice compliment from Susan. Susan, thank you for your kind words.
Thank you, Susan.
From David Marks, the incorporation of technology clearly needs to be commonplace in the education sector. What would you like to see from committed institutions of higher learning in terms of budgets and supporting evolving technology? That's a great question. Great question, David.
It's a great question, David. I think that institutions have to look at the digital space as a serious space. It's a serious space that we're operating in, and it's not just for faculty. It's also for staff as professionals. It is a serious space in which we're engaging with others. It would be good for administration to kind of take a look at budgets and see where we can allocate to be able to have dedicated digital spaces here on campus. You know, the space I'm sitting in right now, that this is a form of a dedicated space here to be able to operate in this realm. So I think that from a technological standpoint and administration, thinking about how can we create these environments so that people can work towards having presence and persona and better social interaction. I think that's something that we need to really think seriously about and think about how we can dedicate budget and funding towards it.
Great question. Dr. Fargnoli, thank you. Thank you very much for doing this for us today. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you for the great questions. We're going to transition now. We have on the line, ready to go for our next presentation as part of the hour, Dr. Ian Wolf of Passaic County Community College. Ian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jake. So as I get my PowerPoint ready to roll here, I did my dissertation at Manhattanville College, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. And my dissertation title was Community College Student Conduct Professionals' Roles During the COVID-19 Pandemic, an Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis. So as we just heard from Jessica, and Jake set us up earlier, the theme for today's session is adapting to new ways of meeting the community college mission. So we heard a little bit about that in terms of digital spaces, and I'm going to build upon it, but share a little bit differently in terms of the human resources aspect inside a little bit of community college staff during the pandemic and thereafter the pandemic. Before I jump into it, just a little background about where I did my doctoral work and my professional background is I did my doctoral work at Manhattanville College, and I defended in July 2021, so coming up on 3 years. So as I reviewed the PowerPoint and everything for this presentation, I had to dust a lot of stuff off. Some of the stuff was a little fuzzy and hazy in my mind, so I had to refamiliarize myself with a lot of things. But what I will say is Manhattanville College is now Manhattanville University. As of April 1st of this year, so like 10 days ago, they switched to become a university instead of a college. And I have 2 of the 3, my dissertation chair and a committee member, Dr. Susan Iverson, and Dr. Yipin Wan on this call from Manhattanville Now University. So thank you for coming, and I'm sure they will shamelessly plug Manhattanville College in the chat. So Manhattanville University, my apologies. I got to get used to that as well. And I started in one other thing that I will say is I started in fall 2018 in terms of my coursework at Manhattanville. And one of the things that was novel for me is during my time, I went from taking classes in person to taking classes remote because of the pandemic. And the cool thing about Manhattanville is, for the most part, they've transitioned to now have their classes for the doctoral program all online and in a hybrid component as well. So just as I was a doctoral student, the pandemic, which I'm going to talk about more, really impacted my ability to be a doctoral student in person, and switching to fully remote, quite honestly, once March 2020 hit. In terms of my background as well, I have always been in the Garden State in terms of my employment, and I've been at 3 community colleges in New Jersey, where I've got colleagues on the line from all 3 institutions. So I started at Bergen Community College, where I worked in student affairs as the coordinator of student conduct and information. I transitioned to Brookdale Community College down the Parkway and served for around 15 months as the director of student conduct and compliance, and then came back north on the Parkway to Passaic County Community College, where I serve currently as the assistant dean for student engagement, and have been here for around 15, 16 months. So all of my experiences in higher education come at the community college level and actually come at the community college level in the state of New Jersey. So rolling right into it, my research interests, as I just said in the last slide, I worked in student conduct, so doing judicial affairs, student discipline, and that was largely predicated on the population that I wanted to study, to see community college student conduct professionals and how they operated. So that was something that was an interest of mine that I had wrote about in various assignments in the beginning part, or the coursework aspect of my dissertation, or excuse me, my doctoral studies. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic was something that everyone experienced, and it was something for me that I wanted to write about. And actually, like, the doctoral program at Manhattanville does a nice job of setting you up for when you're done with coursework, you have pretty much an outline for your proposal done, chapters 1, 2, and 3 of a traditional dissertation. So I had to switch some things actually in the spring of 2020 when the pandemic hit. I wasn't initially going to write about the pandemic. I was going to write about the population of student conduct professionals at community colleges, but I needed to pivot some things during that semester to make the study more appropriate to COVID-19. And the last thing in terms of my research interest was just how do we have this work-life balance, work-life synergy, whatever term we want to call it. So for me, that bled through in border theory, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides as well. The purpose statement for my dissertation ultimately ended at the purpose was to understand how community college student conduct professionals both constructed and maintained borders during their professional or between their professional and personal lives during the COVID-19 pandemic, which resulted in alternative work arrangements. And the one thing that I will say is, as I was writing this and then time moved on during the pandemic, is how are these borders constructed and maintained? And I would say that thinking about it now, they weren't maintained during the pandemic, which is something that I'll talk about as the rest of this presentation goes on. My research questions, I don't want to belabor these too much, but I had a principal research question and then thematic research questions. And my principal research question really was targeted at addressing my purpose statement, is how do these folks at the community college level construct and maintain borders between their personal and professional lives? And then my 3 thematic questions were, how are those borders created? And how are those borders managed? And then for the professional border, how do the controls, demands, and support of really the job change during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic? So these were the research questions that undergirded my study. The components of literature, so the various aspects that I wrote about in my chapter 2, review of literature, focused on community college leaders, the history and key competencies put out by AACC, so the American Association of Community Colleges, about what is expected and really sort of guidelines and best practices for leaders in the sector. Then community college student conduct professional, or excuse me, just student conduct professionals, and how student conduct became a niche in student affairs and at the collegiate level, higher education level, really in an institutionalized manner in the 1980s and 1990s and thereafter. I also talked about in my chapter 2 telecommuting, which is the scholarly word for work from home or working in third places. So not your first place or your second place, which would be your home or your office, but somewhere else. So I wrote about telecommuting. I also talked in my chapter 2 about the public health crisis of COVID-19. I didn't delve into it that much because of it being a novel concept at the time. So I just talked about in my chapter 2 how public health crisis in general, and largely focusing on epidemics, really impacted the ability for professionals to work in in-person offices. And then the last is border theory, which I'll talk about in its own separate slide, is really a theory that was put out by Susan Campbell Clark back in the year 2000. And her work came from the University of Idaho, where basically she was saying that people are border crossers who make daily transitions between 2 worlds. the world of work and the world of family. So think about that from your own vantage point, flexing back and forth between being someone who's a family member and your positionality as relates to your family and your personal life, to switching during the day to whatever your professional job and professional commitments are. And this theory emerged in the 90s and early 2000s from human resources. And one of the major components of border theory is that borders divide time, place, and people associated with work and family roles, and that borders have various functions in terms of permeability, flexibility, and blendability. So the example that I used in my dissertation that I'll illuminate here is, think about someone who works at a family restaurant. Their borders are very fluid and very flexible, where they work with people who are in their family. So there's a lot of going back and forth between being in your family life and in your professional life, compared to someone who maybe works an hour away in a desk job and works long, strenuous hours. There's not a lot of overlap necessarily, just speaking generally here, but not a lot of overlap necessarily between personal life and professional life. It's very rigid and not flexible. So that's just two examples of how borders do function for different folks. This led to me developing a concept map that took the theory, border theory, and how I applied it to my specific study, and led to this concept map. So you'll see on the left side is the community college work-life domain, and on the right side in blue is the personal life family domain. And really the area in the middle is this borderlands in yellow. And this is where people on a daily basis can transition from one side to another and sometimes land in the middle in terms of this borderlands. And then what I have on both sides are different ways that an individual can set strong borders or weaker borders between their work and their personal life. So control, support, and demands on the work side, and then in terms of the family side or personal life side, routines, family, and health. So this was just a graphic that I used to guide my work in thinking about this problem and how I was going to add to the literature. In terms of deploying my study, I used an interpretive phenomenological analysis as my my methodology here. So IPAs are useful for investigating topics that are complex, ambiguous, and emotionally laden, of which the COVID-19 pandemic hit all three of those criteria. What I'll also say about IPA is we heard around a month ago from my colleague, Dr. Evelyn Ortega, and she also deployed an IPA. So what I found really interesting in terms of this practitioner scholar series was that two scholars used IPA as our method, but it's not really used all that much nowadays. I mean, I think it is in vogue more now than when it started a couple of years ago. But I just felt that was kind of funny that Dr. Ortega also used IPA. And IPA is really governed by three sort of pillars. So phenomenology, double hermeneutics, and then ideography. And I'll go into just very quickly details on all of these. So phenomenology is studying a specific phenomenon. Double hermeneutics is making use of your participants' interpretation. So that's the first part. So their interpretation of a specific phenomenon, and then your interpretation of what their interpretation is. So that's where there's two pieces of it. It's what the participant sees in terms of their lived experience, and then you as the researcher observing what your participant is telling you or conveying to you. And then the third is ideography, which is basically saying that every single person has their own lived experiences that are different. Even if two people are going through the same exact thing, they might experience whatever the phenomenon, whatever the situation, whatever the issue is, differently. So that's really the three pillars that guide what an IPA study should look like. For my interviewing, I use the phenomenological approach to interviewing, which is a book that came out in terms of interview protocols from Irving Seidman, a scholar at UMass Amherst. And what I did for my study with my participants is I broke it into three 90-minute interviews conducted in a 3 to 6 week time frame, where each of the interviews focused on one of the aspects of what's written in these purple post-it notes. So first was focusing on the life history. The second was the details of the lived experience. So how did the pandemic impact your ability to work? And then the third should say reflecting on the meaning. But now that this has happened to you, how do you think that this will guide your work or what you will do moving forward? And I had scripted interview protocols for all 3 of these interviews and conducted the interviews between December of 2020 to March 2021. So during the height of the pandemic still. My participants, I had 8 participants that I all recruited through ASCA, which is the Association of Student Conduct Administrators. And for my participant protocol, I used ASCA's regions. So they break down the United States and international into a variety of different geographic regions. And in the United States, they break them down based on geographic sort of groupings of states. So for mine, I had participants ranging from titles as high as Dean of Students to Coordinator of Community Standards, Care and Retention, where there was a diversity in number of years working in the community college sector. And for my geographic regions, I picked places that had experienced COVID-19 pandemic surges in the beginning of the pandemic. So in March, April, May of 2020, and that really informed my geographic region for picking the areas of New England, the Mid-Atlantic states on the East Coast, and then on the West Coast, California, and the Pacific Northwest. So these were my participants, all pseudonyms for them, but I had 8 participants where I did the interview protocol of 3 90-minute interviews. In terms of my data analysis, I used IPA, which says that you should do initial coding and noting, and then jumping to developing subordinate themes, and then third, developing superordinate themes, which are really the major themes that you find through the research. I used coding software, so in vivo as a desktop application to help organize my transcripts and pick out different things that I highlighted using the software. And then I also used participants in vivo code. So that is using the actual words that participants share in my chapter 4, so that I'm paying homage and attributing properly to the participants and the direct words that they're sharing. In terms of my superordinate themes that emerged, I had 3 of them. One was all of a sudden, like overnight, which I'll go into detail in a little bit. The second was structured chaos, and the third was identity matters. In terms of all of a sudden overnight, this is actually an in vivo quote, which came from one of my participants, where they said all of a sudden overnight, things changed. And these are the ways in which things changed, where people that they were working with didn't look as professional. So as Jessica was just talking about, digital spaces on Zoom, the dress code was different, where when people had normally been in business attire, that was not necessarily the case online, and being on Zoom tiles or Zoom squares, where it might have been a t-shirt, there may have been, noises from a child or a baby in the background based on what someone's work situation was. But the dress code was not exactly something that was the same in person. Communication norms over Zoom and email responsiveness shifted, where things basically had to be on Zoom or on email to keep our operations afloat at the community college level. There was also a theme of this isn't working, where technology issues really became exacerbated and very acute. Where if someone didn't have familiarity with the technology, that was glaring and apparent that it wasn't working for everyone in the same way from working from home. And then a lot of the participants that I interviewed talked about a 32-hour work week, where several of the institutions had furloughs and staff had to cut back to working either 4 days a week instead of 5, and were compensated accordingly, or they had to take other job responsibilities to be part of their portfolio. given whatever the needs of their specific institution were during the pandemic. So, for example, one of the participants in the Mid-Atlantic region did student conduct, and that was his primary job. Student conduct numbers were down during the pandemic because things may or may not have been reported. So the institution that this individual worked at assigned them additional work of helping to distribute laptops for the laptop loaner program during the pandemic, and also helped students get connected to do the FAFSA more. So responsibilities shifted all of a sudden, like overnight as well. My second superordinate theme was structured chaos. So this basically is defined as after a couple of weeks, everything settled down, but there was still structured chaos. There was a lot going on, but staff, for the most part, community college student conduct professionals, had a decent grip on what they were expected to do and knew who to contact or who to reach out to if they weren't sure of certain things in this remote work environment. So we're all frustrated. A lot of folks shared they were doing teletherapy during the pandemic, and other folks during the study, community college professionals, said that they had more experiences with alcohol and prescription drugs during this time period, and that there was a higher level of fatigue and just generally coping, not only for the loss of life that some participants felt very close to them, but also just, oh man, I'm on Zoom and I'm on my emails from morning till sundown. And that just really weighing on people. Rolling with the punches, so just figuring out new routines and figuring out, okay, how is it that I socialize in a pandemic world where maybe there isn't that water cooler talk and there aren't the happy hours after work? How do I get that socialization in? And then job security and changing responsibilities, different types of student conduct cases. So there was a spike in academic integrity cases and really a precipitous drop in the number of physical altercations because people weren't physically next to each other during the pandemic. So the type of cases shifted. Connections with supervisors also shifted. One participant from California shared that her supervisor lived not far from her. So they would actually go for walks during the day and do their one-on-ones while they were walking, which wouldn't have even been something that was on their radar before the pandemic started. So different ways of connecting with your supervisors. And then just thinking about the future. A lot of staff that I interviewed as participants said that they weren't entirely sure that they wanted to continue to do this if this was the way that work was going to be in the pandemic and the post-pandemic world. And the last of my superordinate themes was that identity matters, which basically is saying that based on the participants' positionality, they experienced the pandemic differently. And everyone experienced the pandemic differently, as we all know. But these were a couple of the identities that really impacted someone's lived experiences during the pandemic. So relationships, and by that relationships matter. And by that I mean that if someone lived alone versus if they had a partner or children or had to take care of maybe their parents or their grandparents, that really dictated their experiences during the pandemic and as connected to their personal and professional lives. Parenting matters. So some of my participants had children, some did not. Some of them were school-age children, and some of their children were in college or out of college. And the ones who had children in the K-12 system said that they basically had to become a quasi-teacher. And for anyone on this call who was in the same place during the pandemic, I'm sure that resonates for you. But basically, in addition to doing their job and being expected to be super responsive on Zooms, WebExes, whatever it is, and on email, they also had to maybe teach third grade math to their son or daughter who was maybe working in the room next to them, or maybe even at the same kitchen table. Black Lives Matter. So the twin pandemics going on at once, racial injustice in our country, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, the public health crisis. That was something that, based on where participants lived in the country and their other identities, impacted their ability to do student conduct work during the pandemic. Holding students accountable based on your positionality and your racial identity was really something that impacted the participants. and really also impacts anyone who's doing student conduct work, whether or not it's the pandemic or post-pandemic. Politics mattered. So as I said earlier, a lot of my participants were from states that had the pandemic hit them first compared to other states throughout the country. It also just so happened that those states tend to be liberal-leaning states and geographic parts of the country. So politics mattered to them in a lot of the similar ways. But in addition, this was right when the 2020 primary and the presidential election was going on. So that was felt very, very differently by participants, as well as the January 6th insurrection was also something that was very acutely aware for participants, because I was interviewing them at the time that happened. And then health matters. So if people had pre-existing conditions, that was something that impacted their experiences during the pandemic, as well as people's ability to exercise. So a lot of participants said that they had more time on their hands and more flexibility in their time. So they were able to get workouts in or physical exercise in a different way compared to pre-pandemic, where they would have been working in person 35, 40, maybe 40 plus hours per week. So identity really mattered for all the participants that I interviewed in my study. This led me to the concept of liminality. And really that COVID-19 was this liminal space, this liminal psychological space for participants. And really probably this could be extrapolated for every one who lived through the pandemic. The best way that I would describe a liminal space would be to think about a hallway, where you're in the hallway, you're not coming from, and you're coming from somewhere else, and you're not at your final destination yet. So you're working your way through the hallway, and the hallway is this liminal space where you're in between. And this really comes from Victor Turner, the sociologist who in the late 1960s defined this as liminality is neither here nor there. They are betwixt and between the positions assigned by law, custom, convention, and ceremonial. And as I talked about earlier, this liminality is temporal, physical, and psychological. So it could be in your mind, or it could be in the physical spaces that you are in. And this led to my own rendering of liminality as the border eclipse. And this was in my chapter 5 as well, of here's how I'm making meaning of what my participants or the participants were telling me. And I guess it's also coincidental that this is the week of the solar eclipse as well. Didn't plan this when Jake was scheduling who was presenting when. But on the left side of the border eclipse, we've got the pre-pandemic, where there's the personal life and professional life, and this small little area in the middle that is borderlands. And during the pandemic, these two major areas of people's life overlapped, and the borderlands became much more pronounced and a bigger area where people were shifting and transitioning multiple times a day, and much more than they were pre-pandemic. So my graphical representation of what went on was this border eclipse of these two things shifting. Switching to sort of the tail end here of my prepared slides, recommendations for practice. So for student conduct professionals, those recommendations were to be accessible and flexible. So making sure that you're accessible to students. Protecting student information in a remote environment. So that could be something as simple as when you're meeting with a student for a student conduct case or whatever that might be, just checking, hey, can you show me your room or wherever it is, just to make sure that you are alone or with only one support person, and that you're in a private space so that your information is protected and the conversation that we have is really truly a private conversation. And then the third thing is creating a valve check when working from home. So to me, that meant not working around the clock all the time and figuring out, okay, when is what I'm doing enough for the day that I can close my laptop, that I can close my device and pick it up the next time that I'm working, whether that be the next day after a scheduled break or the next week after a weekend. For higher education, human resource professionals, so the recommendations for practice are set clear expectations and be transparent with the workforce. and then leverage innovation and reimagine jobs. And this, I think, is something that is critical and something that I think there's room for improvement all across the board moving forward, where we really need to, at the community college level, make sure that we're having competitive jobs and that we're able to make sure that we're as clear and transparent with the workforce as possible in terms of how they can conduct their work. And then the third is for community college leaders, create a space for healing and reflection, which I think is still necessary, even though it is 3 years later, of making sure that we're talking about this and not letting the pandemic be something in the past and that we aren't learning from or growing from moving forward. Recognizing the unsung heroes of the COVID-19 pandemic. So for me, when I wrote my dissertation, that was the essential workers that needed to be on the ground in person. Those would be the facilities as well as maintenance and perhaps even food service professionals on their respective community college campus. And then foster institutional-wide dialogue on defining a new normal in a post-pandemic world. Recommendations for research, just going quickly here, looking at the clock, future research on border theory and focusing on how other future major disruptions may impact people's personal borders. Test if the border eclipse reverses in the post-pandemic world. I have many thoughts on that, but I'll hold them for this discussion based on time. And then future research on community college personnel, study non-facing personnel pandemic during experiences. So maybe the folks in accounting, maybe the folks in payroll that aren't in a forward-facing, student-facing role, how are their experiences different? And how do their experiences look now in a post-pandemic world? And then future research on student conduct professionals, study compartmentalization techniques for these professionals, and then focus on retention-oriented approaches to work. The significance of my study, it was one of the first dissertations on how COVID-19 pandemic impacted community college professionals. The border theory application to the COVID-19 pandemic was something that I hadn't seen previously. So my study added to that group of scholarly literature, and then emergency telecommunication research of here's a study that was added to the literature of how this specific population did conduct their work during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in summary, I used an IPA study. I had 8 participants where I interviewed them using the phenomenological approach to interviewing. I had 3 superordinate themes, which I talked about in detail. And then my recommendations for future research are applicable to border theorists as well as a wide range of educational leaders, which I just talked about. At this point, I will open it up to questions.
Ian, thank you. Just a wonderful presentation. Maybe I'm a bit biased being a Van Manen and Seidman disciple myself, as you are in the phenomenology space, but just terrific. So we have a couple of, we're a little over time, folks, but we have a couple of comments in the chat that I'll get to. Maybe ask a question or two if any of you may have one. A lot of shout outs here to you from Susan Iverson of Manhattanville here in the chat. Terrific job across the board here, Ian. And for any of you interested in the Manhattanville program, Susan's added the link there in the chat for you. Interesting dissertation. Hardest hurdle, Linda shares, Linda Hall shares, hardest hurdle for her. Teaching laboratory procedure at home, creating self-supported supplies for all students and engaging them when their procedures were very gratifying. Let's see what else in the chat. We certainly didn't need special glasses for the Eclipse that you shared in your screen, Ian. Very helpful for facilities, buildings, and grounds folks as well. Great job across the board, Dr. Wolf. So I had one question. It was one of your recommendations for further study, and you said I would opine about it if time permits, and I don't want you to opine about it, but along similar lines of thinking here, the question I'd written down before you got to the screen, the slide that you'd shared was, we saw the 2 eclipses that you had shared, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, and they're all overlapped. And has it changed now that we're back? And I don't know if there's a correct answer or a right or a wrong answer, but I think part of it might be, it depends on which of those audiences you had spoken with in your dissertation. For the working parents, thank goodness the students are back in school. Thank goodness we have an office to come to. That helped to separate the lines. But for folks who may not have children in the K-12 system, the phone still rings when office is closed, especially for you folks in the student services and student conduct, where you get a call or a message and it could be something that needs your attention right away, and you could be in the middle of anything. So along the same lines, Ian, or different lines, is it dependent on who you spoke with and participated in your study as to whether or not those lines are no longer as compacted together as they used to be?
I definitely think that that's an aspect of it. The identity mattering piece of, hey, here's what your lived experience was during the pandemic. What I would also add to it, and I need to tread delicately here, given my experience at 3 New Jersey community colleges, is the way that institutions also set up their work, whether it be in the office, a blend. I don't think any are fully remote for all positions, but I think that that's also something that really impacts what someone's lived experience is. Where I know that, hey, here in the Garden State and even among our 18 community colleges, different institutions have different types of work arrangements. And I think that that's something for potential employees that they need to consider, but also something for institutions or the employer where they need to maybe consider what is my value prop as it relates to work arrangements, and being clear from the beginning when looking to recruit, as well as communicating those expectations to your existing staff. I think that that's something that's important. I think that that's something that community colleges will still grapple with at the macro level, but it is also something that at the individual level, each person experiences differently. So like, I completely agree with what your assessment is, Jake. And yeah, I would take it a little further to the institution piece as well.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, thank you, Dr. Wolf, and thank you, Dr. Fargnoli. And it was by no coincidence, as you had mentioned, Ian, I did not happen to have the Eclipse in mind when we planned this, nor did I realize that Jessica and her recommendations for further study would include the boundaries between personal and professional. And here we have a fully thought out and well presented research study on that blending of the personal and professional boundaries in the COVID pandemic. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Just as a reminder, our next Practitioner Scholars webinar, the last one of the spring semester, 2024 spring semester, is on Thursday, May 2nd at 12. It's the impact of coaching-based leadership and success planning on the preparation, retention, and success of mid-level leaders in higher education by Dr. Lee Johnson from Passaic County Community College. So we look forward to seeing you folks for that. And thank you all once again for being with us. Jessica and Ian, thank you so much for sharing your learnings with us today. Everyone have a great rest of the day and rest of the week, and be well. We'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.